All right. It is at the top of the hour, and we're going to get started because we have a lot of interesting, at least we hope so, interesting information to share with you. The title of our presentation you can see on the screen, Audits After the PHE, What's Next? So I want to tell you a little bit about who you're going to hear from today and just kind of set the tone for the next hour. My name is Ann Ford. I'm an attorney and a former nurse. I am the managing director of HPS Advise, and I'm an attorney at the law firm of Hall Prangle Schoonveld. We represent healthcare providers, including durable medical equipment companies. We also have Cora Colvin. She is also at HPS Advise. She's a consulting director and a compliance professional. And finally, last but not least, certainly not least, is Noel Neil. He is with ACU-Serve, and Noel is the VP of Corporate Compliance and Auditing there and has a deep knowledge in audits. So together, as a group, we're going to talk with you about how you can prepare for and anticipate the audit landscape after the PHE. A couple of housekeeping items. There is a Q&A function and there's a chat function. If you have a question, we would ask that you put it into the Q&A. At the end of the presentation, we're going to save time for those questions, but I will be monitoring them throughout. If you have a technical problem, you can put that into the chat function. But we would love to hear from you at the end. So please do set up your questions. What we're going to cover today, I guess there's one other housekeeping item, and that is polling questions. We'll walk you through it when we get to it, but there are 3 polling questions throughout, which is our way of kind of talking to you or interacting with you in real time during this webinar. The topics we're going to cover, clearly we're going to talk about the PHE and the end of it, and then what happens next. In particular, we're going to have Cora talk a lot about the compliance programs and change management and really what you can do to get ready for this. And then Noel will talk in more detail about audit strategies and how to handle those audits when they come in. We'll close with a Q&A at the end. So with that, I'm going to go to the first polling question. I will read it for you, and then you will see a screen pop up. You'll be able to select a response with your mouse. The following best describes how my company is preparing for post-PHE audits. A, we have a post-PHE audit readiness plan in place. B, we are in the process of developing a post-PHE audit readiness plan. C, we will use what we have in place already. Or D, wait, what's a post-PHE audit readiness plan? So if you could please display the results. Okay. So we have 13% has a post-PHE audit readiness plan in place. About a third of you are in the process of developing one. The approximately a little more than a third are going to use what you have in place already. And a few of you are perhaps in need of learning a little bit more about a PHE audit readiness plan. Thank you for that. That's going to set us up nicely for the specific content that Cora and Neil are going to talk about in a minute. Just to set the stage a bit, the PHE is going to end finally on May 11th, 2023. I know that most of you have been made aware of that. It's not necessarily something that you need to hide under the table for. In fact, after today, we're going to hope that you feel ready to go and emboldened to be ready to meet any audit demands after the PHE. It's been a while. It's been since early 2020 since we've had these flexibilities that were put in place during the PHE that are now going to go away. Because of this transition period, we know there's a lot of questions, and CMS has answered some of those questions, more to come. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Cora Colvin.
Thank you, Anne. So we're going to start with a question more around change. So does your organization have a formal process to make workforce aware of new policies or changes in policies? So this question actually comes directly from the OIG's Measuring Compliance Program Effectiveness Resource Guide. If you're not familiar with this guide, it's a great audit readiness resource tool. I highly recommend familiarizing yourself with it. This is what they'll be asking. These questions are what they'll be asking in the event that they're ever knocking at your door investigating. So it's good to familiarize yourself with it. As Anne mentioned, I'll give about 20 seconds to answer the question since this is a fairly easy one. Yes, no, or I don't know. Wow, that's impressive. So 79% of responders have a mechanism for formally making their employees aware of new policies or changes in policies. This is excellent. This means that you'll be prepared to address the key components of change, specifically with foundations of policies when moving through these post-PHE audit strategies. So we can close that and move on to the next slide. So hopefully you guys have seen this before. These are the 7 elements of an effective compliance program gifted to us by the OIG. They tell us that having an effective compliance program, which by the way includes the regular monitoring and auditing, not only does it reduce risk within an organization, but it can also lead to leniency by regulators and prosecutors. And it can also reduce the potential liability and penalties of a corporation if ever involved in an investigation. So let's do a quick recap of the 7 elements. Have a compliance officer, obviously have your written policies and procedures, document them, and make sure that the training on these policies are documented as well. Effective training and education. I highly recommend if you don't have risk-based training in place, specifically around PHE, since that's the topic of today, making sure that you have PHE type issues and training specifically highlighted as a part of your compliance program right now. Effective lines of communication, meaning make sure that everyone's aware how to report an issue if there are any in the organization. Well-publicized disciplinary policies. We'll talk about accountability later. It's really important when it comes down to an effective compliance program and also change management. Risk identification, which is also really important as a part of an effective compliance program, and change management. There's a lot of simulators we'll talk about in the next slide. And then prompt response by compliance in the event of any issues. If your organization doesn't have an operationalized compliance program, I highly recommend getting one in place. When I say operationalize, I don't mean a paper program that we give to a regulating body or our surveyors when they come in and they're checking. I mean an actual program with plans and actions and data that shows that the program is impacting the culture of the organization. So as I mentioned on the last slide, there's a lot of similarities between an effective compliance program and change management. We talked about having a compliance officer. That's the strong leadership, the effective communication we've talked about as an effective compliance program, the stakeholder engagement, we'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide, planning and prep, which includes risk assessments, again, as an element of an effective compliance program, monitoring and evaluation, and then of course, training and education is key to any change management timeframe, program, and also a compliance program. We can move on to the next slide. I thought this was funny. This is a visual example to me of what happens when we're going through changes as humans. This guy has a headache. He is not being very effective right now. He's probably crying. If he had eyes, I'm sure that we'd be seeing tears coming down his eyes right now. Ultimately, make changes realistic. You know, when we're talking about change, even post PHE, make sure that hopefully you've started now. And it sounds like most of you have. There was only 17% that haven't started yet. So hopefully you have some takeaway today. But so it sounds like you guys are working on that and have some strategies in place already, but start now if you have not. I would consider having a post PHE committee. That means getting a group of people together, having some strategy, doing some monitoring, making sure that you're meeting your goals, providing resources. Those resources include communication. Get people together, have them talk about what they're going through and any concerns that they might have. And hit the, make sure that you're confronting the reality of your operational issues head on. So if you have, for example, an employee, a department or employee that tends to struggle when dealing with change, this is the time to really give them that extra support, that extra care, and making sure that they have what they need in order to be effective during this change. That's really what effective change management is. It's really honing in on the weaknesses and making sure you're supporting them. Have those operational roles in place, and then utilize the components of your compliance program to mitigate risks. Next slide. All right, so utilizing compliance programs to mitigate risks, here are 5 key things to consider. Obviously, you're going to hear risk assessment probably several times in this presentation. It's really important. Identifying the risk specific to post-PHE audits. Again, make sure that you're coming together, that you're adding this on to your standard annual compliance risk assessment, and that you've added a specific area for addressing the risks that are specific to this. And again, consider the specific employee and department skill sets and any operational changes, and prioritizing by the likelihood of risk. Reviewing policies and procedures, which we will touch on a little bit more on the next slide. Ensure they're updated, using the version control, memorializing the changes. This is really important. A lot of the information gets archived through some of the regulators, so it's important that if you're dealing with the audit in the future, that you have this already memorialized in your documentation to reference. Conduct the trainings, and then use techniques to ensure employees understand the training. That can be communication, it can be a touch base, it can also be a test. Measure the KPIs. So what are the key performance indicators that you want to hit as associated with this change? Make sure that you have it documented, that people are on the same page about it, and the report to leadership team and communicate that out to all internal stakeholders, including the employees that are involved, so they're aware how everyone is doing. Auditing and monitoring. Again, this is key as a part of this entire presentation. Make sure that you've used the risk assessment to focus on where to audit. Identify a monitoring plan and make sure that you're doing this consistently. It might be a good idea to consider having an independent auditor come in towards the end of the year to see how it's gone and make sure that there's nothing that you guys have missed. And then again, communicate the findings to compliance if they are not involved, and using corrective action plans. This is also important. I would monitor any code changes that are specific to this PHE. I would have them on an audit and monitoring plan, at least for the next 90 days after, to make sure that everyone is adapting to the change and making the necessary adjustments to how they are billing and coding. Monitor your corrective action plans. So going back to policies and procedures, that initial question that I asked, as everyone knows, the policies and procedures are fundamental to operations. They're the key element of one of the key elements of an effective compliance program, and this is saying how we do what we do. So as I mentioned, version control is necessary. If you don't currently have your policies and procedure in a document control framework that includes tracking the version control, I highly recommend that you do that, starting with all the changes with PHE. It's really important to have those version controls so you can reference when you're doing internal auditing, and also when you have any external auditors come in, or if you have an auditing body come in and audit, so that you can have that as a reference. If you have received any from non-government payers, if there's been any type of additional guidance that you've been receiving via email or any other communication, it's very important to memorialize that as well. Make sure that you have that stowed away and ready to access in the event of, there's employee changes always happening, whether if it's the government or a private payer. Make sure that you have this documented if you were given any additional waivers or a policy, even for your private payers. And make sure that you're treating your policies and procedures as your single source of truth for business operations. So again, questions to ask ourselves: have we properly documented the prior changes and then the current ones in place? If not, I would go through that exercise and make sure that post PHE you have the current state, but also that you have at least documented the old. Again, track the version control, archive the old versions, and make sure that you're using procedures as a research for identifying potential billing concerns, meaning if you've identified as you're going through this review that there was a policy that wasn't updated or a procedure that wasn't updated that's impacted by PHE, that you're going back and reviewing that and make sure that there wasn't any billing concerns that was specific to that miss of change of policy or procedure. Okay, next slide. All right, so this is always a fun one, accountability. So to me, another visual, I like visuals of accountabilities plus humans is like we run from it. No one likes to have conversations around accountability. Who likes being held accountable? It's just one of those areas that we tend to run from. I found this quote by Mina B, who I have no idea who she is, but I loved her quote. Being held accountable is an act of generosity and compassion. It is a gift that someone gives us to correct our wrongs, unlearn, and do better for the sake of our own growth. And it might be uncomfortable, but it's worth the discomfort. So this is an important aspect of, accountability. That's actually a gift to the other person. We can move to the next slide. And here are 4 things to consider when we think about making sure that when we're going through this process of change management, that we're holding ourselves accountable as leaders in the organization or individual contributors of the organization, that we're all holding ourselves accountable, and as leaders, holding our employees accountable for adapting to the change. So we'll start off with roles, establish the clear roles. If you have change agents, they're really helpful and they help to facilitate change in an organization. Make sure that everyone understands their role and the impact on quality. Without directly speaking to employees about their errors, you can still communicate the cost of an error specific to billing to the team members so they can have a connection to that end result. Also, review the job descriptions to ensure alignment with reality. This is a good time where, whether if it's change management or just specific to the role, that everyone is aligned with what's specific to the job description. And when I say that, I mean if someone has an auditing or monitoring role, that these components that they're aware that this is a primary importance right now during these times of change. Goals, so setting clear goals and expectations around the changes and giving opportunities for input from employees during the time of change, and identifying the big picture goals and how the employees' work feeds into the larger strategic vision. And again, we always want to have those regular performance evaluations, which is holding them accountable to the goals. And again, this means the leaders have to be ready to have those potentially difficult conversations. Transparency is important. And with that, it's transparent about escalation. If there's a specific escalation approach that we're taking in order to reduce risk associated with billing errors, be transparent about it. Make sure that everyone's on the same page about the escalation guidelines in the handbook, clearly defining the consequences if people aren't adapting to change. This is really important as well. And this is something that I think we miss a lot in change management and also sometimes in our compliance program is incentivizing and rewarding positive behavior publicly. So in the event that we have someone who's maneuvering positively through the change or has really high accuracy with billing, considering the changes, that we find this as an opportunity to positively hold people accountable and escalating it and showing it publicly that, we're doing good. And then finally, the management piece. And this is where it gets hard because sometimes our leadership isn't trained to have productive, difficult conversations. So this is a good time to reach out to your HR departments and have them do a session on difficult conversations with your leadership team. And if you are one of the leaders and know this is the area of opportunity, there are so many, there's videos on YouTube. I'm sure there's something on LinkedIn where you can take a short course to help you navigate difficult conversations, because it isn't an area of leadership that most people enjoy. Support new management. Make sure if someone has become a new leader during these times that they have had these tools and that they're trained appropriately to support change management initiatives, and ensure that the management has tools that give feedback. So those are the documents for just warnings, corrective action plans. Make sure that the management team has the resources to hold people accountable. And then if a leader isn't doing that, they also need to be held accountable as necessary. So I think this is one of the forgotten areas that isn't targeted when we think about change or even compliance, but this is a skill set that needs to be built during these times and definitely refreshed as a whole, specifically with management as well. Next slide. All right, so jumping into more specific around audit readiness. So again, as I mentioned, risk management, we'll start there, upper right-hand corner. Identify the risk associated, monitor and audit for at least the next 90 days to 6 months. Raise awareness with the employees of the risk management findings and their role in reducing the risks. So this means communicating the audit findings. And again, reward and incentivize those that are adapting well and producing quality work. We've talked about training. Won't touch on that too much anymore, but again, specific training, more auditing. Go figure. Continuous internal monitoring is key to ensure audit readiness. The only way you'll be prepared for an auditor coming in is if you are internally auditing. If this hasn't been prioritized in the past, it definitely needs to be, specifically again, because a change means it's a higher risk over the next 90 days to 6 months. Make sure you're putting more effort and resources towards monitoring and auditing yourself, specifically with billing. And identifying those key performance indicators that address the change specifically. And then again, corrective action plans. And then finally, documentation. So ensure key documents are complete, accurate, and current. Documents, on the next slide, we'll go into a little bit more about those, but mechanisms for reporting, auditing, and monitoring resources, and performance evaluation criteria for starters. So key documents to keep audit ready. So some of the obvious policies and procedures, medical records, billing, training, all of the good stuff that a lot of our accrediting bodies come in and ask us for. Some of the not so obvious are your corporate compliance program and plans. And the program is typically a document that, from my experience in consulting, is one of those that kind of gets dusted off and isn't always operationalized. But the operationalization is in the plans. So we'll want to say a training plan, an auditing plan, a communication plan. We'll want to see these plans and then the action that was taken. So this is important, especially in the event of any escalation of any audit or investigation. Company-wide or employee compliance communication. So this means if we have sent out directive to our organization or employees with regards to compliance, we want to make sure that those are memorialized. Sometimes those are in inboxes and then they just go by the wayside, but those are important and need to be saved as well. Licensing, which is really important, because if you're not aware, if you are ever operating without licensure, so if it's expired or you didn't have a license and you have billed the government, that payment is it's not a good payment. That payment is an issue. So it's really important to make sure that when you're thinking about your documentation, that you're considering your dates of licensure associated with action, especially if you are doing any mail order and you have different facilities potentially shipping to patients. Want to make sure that your licensing is covered and you have that documented. Make sure the 855S is documented and correct with the right product categories, that your governing board has training on compliance. This is important, and this is something that an auditor, especially with regards to an investigation, would ask. They would want to make sure that the board and that leadership is trained on compliance. Make sure that, again, that your correspondence with the regulators, DME Max or private payers, is documented, that you have proof of your OIG screenings, and that so that we can show that everyone's being held accountable consistently and fairly, that the results from disciplinary actions that have been punished. So any terminations, counseling, suspensions, and corrective action plans specific to employees, that we have that so we can show that everyone is being treated fairly, and that, for example, leaders and executives are not being forgiven or not treated the same as other employees when it comes to actions of non-compliance. So that is where I stop and hand it over to Noel to dive deeper into the audit strategies post PHE.
Thank you very much, Cora. But just before I move on to the audit strategy, though, something that you mentioned I really wanted to kind of hone in on and it's the update of the A55S. I actually have a few clients who have received revocation just because their A55S had a particular supply for a state that they don't service the patients in, but that state required a licensure to which they didn't have on file. So the provider had no intention of servicing that item, that supply. The provider was particularly doing CGM and just so happened to have ostomy supplies selected on the A55S in a state that require licensure. And because of that, their P10 was suspended, was revocated. So it's very important, just underline and emphasizing what Cora mentioned about updating your A55S. If you're not providing that product, it's best to remove it from your A55S. In the
Thank
past,
you.
the NSCs didn't really focus so much on that, but as you guys are probably aware, the name changed and a new contractor has been awarded. And the way they're viewing it, they're saying there's an intent. So even though you have not dispensed that item, the fact that you have it on your A55S, they're viewing it as you have an intention to furnish an item without the appropriate licensor. So very important.
Thank you for that, Noel. And I'll just add that, this is we're talking quickly through a lot of the content. So please make sure that, you'll have this presentation after and look at all the bullet points and make sure that you understand what we're saying. And if there's any questions, you can reach out to us afterwards because, again, we're talking fast, but these are really important to consider, like the implications are serious. Thank you, Noel.
Great, thank you. All right, so audit strategy. So why are audit and appeal strategies important, especially now in this post-PHE world? There are a couple of things that I look at to try and predict what it is that we're going to see for the upcoming year or the season of audits. And the first thing I typically look at is the cert error rate. On the board, I do a comparison between 2021 and 2022. The data of the claims, it's always a year behind. So for 2021 cert results, it's claims from 2019 into 2020. And likewise, the data from 2022 is data from July 2020 into 2021. So this data actually reflects more so the PHE environment of claims that we've seen audited. What we look at is the DME cert error rate. Fortunately, the error rate actually went down from 2021 to 2022 from 28%, 28.64% to 25.24%. That's good. And I think all of you need to really pat yourself on the back because it's your hard work that really saw that reduction in error. But relatively speaking, you can see that DME is still significantly higher than all the other product categories. All the other areas of Part A, Part B, hospital, they're all single digits error rates, even though the dollar amount may be higher than DME. Unfortunately, the government has a tunnel vision on errors and not necessarily the financial or the fiscal impact to the Medicare Trust Fund or to the government. So will be a continued scrutiny on DME to drive that error rate down. So we absolutely will see more DME audits out there just because the error rate continues to be high. Next. So the other thing that I look at is the ALJ backlog. If you've done any form of audits or appeal in this realm, you know that for a very long time, we had this big issue of ALJ backlog, cases that should have taken place within 90 days according to the statute. They were taking 5, 6, 7 years for a case to be heard and for you to receive a decision. A lot of you might be familiar with the lawsuit filed by the American Hospital Association, and that was appealed and upheld at the higher court level that the government have to get rid of the backlog by fiscal year 2022. And from as far as I'm concerned, they've actually achieved that goal, or they're very close to it. I have ALJs that I filed and I've gotten the case heard and a decision within 60 days. So they're definitely getting there. There's still a few claims that we have that are older, but we've seen that they've made significant progress in getting rid of that backlog. So when the ALJ backlog is reduced, then they open up the floodgates, and I have some data that I'll probably share and perhaps at the main session when we have a lot more time. But you can see that the ALJs are currently staffed for a lot more appeals than they're currently getting. So what typically happens in the realm of audits, once the ALJ is cleared up, CMS looks at that and said, well, the system can actually take more audits. So let us just open up the floodgate, allow the RACs and the different entities to actually do their audits and see how those claims kind of wiggle their way through the appeals process, and eventually some potentially will may come to the ALJ. So that's another factor that I look at to predict a very audit heavy activity post PHE. The final thing, which is a perfect segue, is the PHE ending in May 11, 2023. And we'll talk a little bit about what we know thus far as we get on in the presentation and what we're speculating or expecting to see. So just before we get into that, though, so a lot of the waivers are going to end, and so we're expecting to see a lot of these audits. A lot of the audits have been we've not seen a lot of audit on the respiratory products during the PHE, not a lot of audits on CGM. And we've seen, especially for CGM, the utilization has quadrupled during the PHE. So we're expecting to see some audits on that particular product category post PHE, just to make sure that everything is going well. Can move on to the next slide. So I just want to get a feel for the different audits that you guys are receiving currently. So we're going to publish another poll, and I wanted to know for calendar year 2022 and to date, how many audits have you received, the different types of audits you've received from government payers, whether it is TPE, SMRC, the RACs, the UPECs, the CERT. You can select multiple options. So if you receive multiple, you can select those. So I just want to kind of toll that number. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to select, and we'll display the results shortly thereafter. All right, we can, I think, wrap up the poll question at this point, and let's see what we have. Well, awesome. All right, so we see that there's been some activities on the RAC. It's probably where I was expecting the most, the RACs and the CERTs, and for reasons we'll talk about here throughout this presentation. So this seems really consistent with what I've seen across our client base as well.
And we recently, sorry to interrupt, we as I mentioned to you earlier, we had done a survey at a recent Medicare contractor conference and received similar. So we're seeing the exact same things when it comes to over the past, since 2022, that the RAC and the TPE and also the CERTs are the highest amongst DME providers.
Awesome. I am extremely happy that there's just a small percentage of folks that are being audited by the UPIC, and you'll understand why as we progress. So great feedback, consistent with what I thought. So thank you for taking those questions on. All right, so we're going to look at the different auditing entities. I normally like to call it the alphabet soup of auditing entities. So you have CERT, RACs, UPIC, SMRC, MACs, and you have OIGs. So we're going to look at each and every one of them, and just to kind of give you an idea as to what to expect. So the first one we're going to talk about is the CERT. So the CERT is really the acronym for Comprehensive Air Rate Testing Contractors. And from your indication, it seems as if a lot of you are familiar with them. Their goal is really to do random audits on post-payment claims to really determine if there's underpayment or overpayment. There are times where the CERT will review a claim, and if the MAC failed to pay it correctly, meaning they underpaid, they will cite that as an error and you'll receive additional payment. So their job is to look at not just overpayment, but also underpayment, and to verify that the claim is actually paid correctly. The errors that come from the CERT, they actually go against the supplier and the DME MAC. So they're pretty much like policing the entire system. Did the DME MAC process this correctly? And if not, then they cite the error. So it's very important that when you do receive a CERT request, that you respond timely and respond completely as well. And if the CERT actually denies a claim for you and you disagree with the determination, always appeal. The CERT has a limited window in which they report errors. If you receive an error message from the cert and you appeal it timely and that error is overturned, that error is then removed from you as a supplier, and it's removed from you from the Medicare program as well. So it's important that you file those appeal. Also, as a company, you have a cert error rate. So the volume of certs that you get as a company, if you're failing all of your cert error rates, you're going to have a high company cert error rate, and that can lead to additional investigation and additional referral. So it's very important when you do get a cert, always make sure that you provide a complete response, provide all the documentation that they request. Oftentimes, if documentation is provided and something is missing, the cert will send you what is known as a development letter or additional documentation request. Please respond to those, because the cert error rate not only impacts your company, but it impacts us as an industry. So the more errors we can get overturned or even avoid, then we'll see that error rate continue to trend, and hopefully we can get the government to just stop auditing or reduce the volume of auditing to DME, and maybe move on to hospice or home health or one of those other areas. So the cert error rate is definitely a driving factor into that. The next entity is the RAC, the Recovery Auditing Contractor. And the Recovery Auditing Contractor, they resume audits in August of 2020. For those of you who remember, when the public health emergency was announced, CMS basically pumped the brakes on most audits because they wanted to allow providers to focus their resources on taking care of the customers, taking care of the patients, get the patients out of the hospital, allow them to stay at home. So all the resources were needed to focus solely on that. As we kind of come towards the end of 2020, things kind of normalized. We got more information about COVID, and more information became publicly available with vaccine and different things. And the government decided that it was appropriate for them to kind of phase back into the audits. So slowly they actually resumed the audits. They started off with the RACs on August of 2020. So the RACs were able to audit claims, and any audits that were prior to the suspension, they had released those claims. So the RAC will be, their purpose is to look at post-payment claims. Their contract, their scope of work solely is to look at post-payment, improper payment. There is something rather interesting about the RAC contractor, the Recovery Auditing Contractor. They're somewhat contingency based. So you need to be watchful for them, because if they come and they find a low-hanging fruit, they're going to keep on coming within some limited parameters. So if you fail to respond, perfect example, I had a client who came to us to help with audits because they had not responded to some RACs, and there was a $250,000 recoupment offset from their check, and they were just freaking out. And immediately after that, the RACs just unloaded on them multiple other requests for all of their locations that were associated with their tax ID. So they look at it as, okay, we did this and we got this money back, so we're going to keep on doing that, because they get a percentage of the recoveries that they recover from CMS. That's their part of their scope of work, is that they're contingency based. So with the RAC though, one of the beauty of how the RAC program is structured or restructured since the whole hospital lawsuit and with the ALJ backlog. Can we just go back real quick to the other slide real quick? Sorry. They have approved issues. So the RAC can't just get up tomorrow and decide that I'm going to audit you on CGMs. The RAC has to submit to CMS to get approval on particular product categories or particular issues before they can actually start auditing those. And CMS has to review the data and give them the opportunities to audit you as a provider or audit the industry as a provider. They do all complex reviews versus automated reviews. Just for a quick synopsis of the complex review versus automated review. Complex reviews where they send you a request for medical documentation. So they ask you for the progress notes, the order, and the proof of delivery refill requests, if applicable, and then you provide that information to them. They typically give you 45 days to respond. And when you respond, they have about 30 days to actually review the documentation and give you findings. And if you disagree with the findings, there's a period where you can submit an open discussion request where you can tell them, I don't agree with it, and they'll review it and so on. The automated reviews are a little simpler for them because they do data analysis. So sometimes you'll get a letter from the RAC that says, we're taking the money back on this claim because our records indicate the patient was in a hospital on the date of service. You run eligibility yourself and you realize that's the truth. There's not much that you can do. Discretionary extension is the last thing on this slide. I will encourage you all. This is something that was in existence prior to the public health emergency, but it got expanded during the PHE. If you receive a RAC request and you need additional time to respond, reach out to them. There's a phone number and there's an email address. Tell them that you need additional time to respond to the request, and at their discretion, they will grant it. I've yet to see an opportunity where they denied the request for an extension. So please utilize that. It's better if you request the time and provide a complete response than not have a response, because if you don't, they will issue a technical denial and will move towards automatic offsetting of those balances. All right. So for the RAC, there are some approved issues that have been added. So enteral and parenteral nutrition, and there's a whole list. I think they have about 45 items on there as approved issues, and about 41 of them are DME, and I think the like 1 or 2 might be home health or hospice. So recently at a meeting, we asked the RACs, why is it that there's so much DMEs? And I guess they're trying to make some adjustments to that system to have some equilibrium between the different entities that they do perform audits. But majority of the approved issues that are on the RAC list of approved issues currently are DME. So these are just some of them. There's the spinal orthosis urological supplies, the PCD, the pneumatic compression device, surgical dressing, and many other items that are on the list. Going back to 2017, what we learned is that the MACs don't remove approved issues because they can revisit them at any time. So even though they may not necessarily be actively auditing that approved issue, they can go back to it once it's on that list. They rarely ever remove anything from the list, they add to it. All right, so the Unified Program Integrity Contractor, the UPIC. All right, so these folks are responsible for investigating allegations of fraud made by beneficiary provider suppliers, CMS, OIG, or other sources, and as well as they do proactive data analysis. So if they run through the data analysis and they see that you're billing, you just started as a company, and then all of a sudden you're doing like 300,000 in a week of a particular product category, and then it keeps on going at alarming rate, the UPIC might actually just send you a request, not necessarily suspend you because they're, trusting you, but they're verifying. But if they send you a request and based on what they're seeing, it doesn't look like it passes the smell test of compliance, then they will move towards more aggressive measures. Also, beneficiary complaint, when beneficiary call 1-800-MEDICARE, depend if your suppliers have received multiple complaints, then it may be a referral over to the UPIC. Typically, the regulations allow the UPIC to have kind of like 5 issues or 5 claims, essentially, that they deem to be improper. And the UPIC can utilize some really stringent tools that are at their disposal. They can suspend your PTAN, which is rough. I mean, if you're not getting any money from Medicare, especially if you're primary source, if you have a big majority of your patients are coming in from Medicare, they can suspend your PTAN, and it could be just one UPIC within one region, and you're a national supplier, and they're suspending all of your payments. So and in some instances, you might even be required to still continue to service those patients, and not getting that money in. So payment suspensions, they're horrible. I've seen them cripple a lot of suppliers. I've assisted a lot of providers who fight them, but I've seen a lot of providers who just financially could not afford to fight those suspension. They'll do pre and post payment audits as well. And then they'll do extrapolation. And really, the simplest way for me to explain an extrapolation without getting into the gory detail is they audit 10 claims for you. And the 10 claims spans over 3 years. So let's say the 10 claims spans from 2020, 21, 22, over 3 years. And of that 10 claims, they said 9 of those 10 claims actually denied. So they're saying that you have a 90% error rate. So they're going to take back 90% of what they paid you over those 3 years, which can be millions. I've seen an actual overpayment, meaning the overpayment on the actual claim, to be about $4,000, but that extrapolates into about $2.5 million. And that $2.5 million is the government is actually actively taking that on. So it's important to, again, make sure that you have routine compliance monitor. And most importantly, when you see the UPIC requests, I would definitely say take them seriously, especially if there are allegations of fraud. I would definitely say get a competent healthcare attorney involved, that you can have privileged information, and Anne can probably speak to that as well. I'm sure she's taken on a lot of cases where the UPIC has been involved, and competent legal representation in conjunction with a good consulting firm who understands the documentation requirements and the audit processes is a good partnership to that. So Anne, is there anything else that you'd like to add on that?
Just briefly, thanks, Noel. Yeah, this is, as your responses indicated, I think it was only 7% of you had received a UPIC in 2022. A couple things to say about that, which is, it's a good thing because it's not like the other audits. This one's, there's actually starting with the purpose of investigating an allegation of fraud. So you're already not on the same level playing field that you are with the other audits. That shouldn't take them seriously as well. So getting somebody involved early is, and being proactive on defending these, making sure that you do take every opportunity to appeal at every stage. The timelines are relatively short and can be somewhat draconian. So having competent counsel to help you out with that is going to be key. And I also want to just underscore, even though these are usually someone's going to show up at your place of business, it's not going to be announced, you can still prepare. And I would just encourage you to go back and look at the slides that Cora presented on, because again, being prepared with your documentation and your training and having all of those, not just obvious documents, but the documents that are not as obvious, ready to go is pretty important. I also want to point out that if you get a request from a UPIC contractor and it asks for leases or some other things about your business program or your business plan, that is another reason for heightened concern. They're not just looking then at the data mining that they've done, but they're also have some indication that they're looking at how you do business and where you get referrals. Again, I think we've beaten this horse to death a couple of times, but it's pretty important.
It is important, and we made emphasis on this particular contractor because it's very important. Not that the other contractors don't move towards suspension or have the ability to make referrals, but the UPIC is really the entity that actually does the suspension. So when you see them involved, please take them seriously. And I just wanted to touch on this real quick, just because I saw the question pop up, Anne, while you were talking. Will the request state it's a UPIC? It will say Unified Program Integrity Contractor. The contracts have been awarded to different company. So there's Clarent, there's Safeguard Services. It's based on the regions. There's UPIC West, UPIC East, and so on. So it will tell you, though, that it is a Unified Program Integrity Contractor. It will be indicated somewhere on the request. All right, thanks, Anne. All right, so the SMRC, and guys, we're probably just going through the information because we want to get through it as quickly as possible. I think Anne mentioned this earlier, but we're doing kind of like a follow-up presentation at the MAMES conference in later this month, so which will have a lot more time to kind of run through these and get a lot more questions answered. So we're trying to get through this as quickly as possible to take some of your questions. But if you've not registered for MAMES yet, please do that, because we're going to be doing a follow-up presentation on this, and which gives us more time to kind of dive into some of the specifics of these particular policies. So the SMRC, the Supplemental Medical Review Contractor, they're a contract by CMS to do supplemental medical review, somewhat similar to the RAC program. They audit claims on a post-payment basis. But one of the things that is a little bit different with the this SMRC is sometimes the CMS will come to them with special projects For example, I just went through an audit for a client of mine who does PMDs. The PMDs are all prior authorized, but it looks like CMS was auditing the doctor, and somehow the referrals made by that doctor got caught up into that mess, and they audited the provider who the doctor sent referrals to. Fortunately, we went through that audit with no errors, 100% successful. But the SMRC will do these, and they also have the routine audits that they do perform on, similar to the RAC, where they audit different product categories. They've done audits on CPAP supplies in the past. They're doing audits now on surgical dressing, and certainly CMS can give them directives to audit any particular areas. So the SMRC, they do special projects, as I mentioned, just to protect the trust fund. And they focus on medical reviews and including vulnerabilities in the system. So it's just another safeguard contractors that helps with the reduction of the error rates in the program. All right, and then the DME MAC, we probably are the most familiar with them. I think I saw based on the respondents, we see a lot of the DME MAC responses. So TPE, the target, probe, and educate, where they select 10 sample claims from you. And if you pass those 10 claims, then you're placed on audit reprieve for a year for that product category. But if one of those 10 claims deny, they move you on to round 1 and they audit a few more claims. And from there, if you continue to have high error rates, then they'll extend the rounds until they make referrals to CMS. Fortunately, I've not heard of any providers who have gone up to round 3 or referrals to CMS. So it seems like the program is accomplishing its intended goal, which is to educate providers to curtail the amount of errors. Beneficiary complaints are important. Oops, sorry. With the DME MAX as well, beneficiary complaints are when patients call 1-800-Medicare and the referral gets sent to Medicare. Please respond to those. Please don't ignore those, because those are things that lead up to potential UPIC referrals. If there's a lot of beneficiary complaints, and especially if they go unanswered or you don't have justification for it, listen, patients are always going to they're always going to complain. I tell providers, you can do your best, but there are times where they call 1-800-Medicare and 1-800-Medicare don't even understand Medicare guidelines. And sometimes they file a complaint and try to compel you to do things that are not complicit with the published guidelines. So knowing your rules and regulations, your policy is important to make sure that you don't necessarily fall for their traps, but always respond to the audit requests. For TPE, make sure you're checking the portals. For curable errors, make sure that you're listening out for those. The DME MAX will reach out to you and say, hey, I received this progress notes, but it's not signed. Can you send me over a signature attestation? Make sure that you're doing that. And an audit request, again, if you receive an audit and you just didn't have the manpower, the staff in order to respond to that audit, reach out to the TPE mailbox as well, or the respective MAC, and ask for extension, and they will give you courtesy and discretionary extension as they deem appropriate. Thank you, Anne. These are just some of the items that are on TPE. The GW one, I wanted to talk a little bit about it because I think it was last year I did a presentation at MAMES on the GW modifier, and it's for patients who are on hospice and are getting DME. Virtually, Medicare and OIG, CMS have said most items are covered under the hospice benefit, but there are a few exceptions, very limited exceptions, where an item would be separately covered by the Medicare administrative contractor while the patient is on hospice. And it's only if that particular item is unrelated to the patient hospice diagnosis or related condition. The OIG in the report, I went over that report in great details at MAMES. And in that report, CMS had recommended that the MACs actually conduct audit on a pre and post-payment basis for claims that have been billed with the GW modifier. And a couple of weeks ago, CGS rather, the jurisdiction B and C contractor, announced that they are going to be doing TPE. In fact, they've actually mailed out letters to a few suppliers who build volumes of GW modifiers. So be mindful of that. A different conversation, but using a GW modifier inappropriately will and could potentially lead to False Claims Act violation. So it's very important that you guys are monitoring that. All right, next slide, please. All right, so successful audit strategy. So these are some of the things that I think that transcends PHE, but even more so important now PHE because of the volume we're expecting. A good offense is the best defense. Audit defense begin at intake. Your intake should be your very, 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 very important department in your organization. It should be one of the most important departments in your organization because they're the one that are qualifying the patients for these items. Typically after the item has been dispensed and billed, there's not a lot that you can do at that point because if the doctor didn't have that information within the medical records, having an addendum done after you receive an audit doesn't really carry much weight. So making sure that your audit team is aware of all of the appropriate regulations, the LCDs, invest in them, send them to training, have them do online webinars, get them do specialized training, make sure that they understand all of the documentation requirements, the policies that are changing, for example, oxygen, CGMs, enteral, parenteral nutrition. Make sure that your intake team is abreast of all the changes that are happening. And I think this ties back into something that Cora mentioned in change management. Make sure that they're aware of all the changes so that they're not stuck using an old checklist, using old parameters to qualify a patient when the rules have changed. Utilize a separator sheet. I've heard from auditing entities that we've dealt with directly on our clients' behalf that they like our audits because what we do, we make sure that it's prepared very clean and nice for them. This may seem like a simple thing, but I promise you, since we've implemented this years ago, we've seen a lot less errors. By separated sheet, I mean have a sheet that details the item that precedes the document. For example, we have on ours, we'll have SWO, and then immediately after that sheet, we actually attach the SWO. Proof of delivery, we attach that. Refill request, home assessment. That way, you don't have the auditors guessing what document they're actually looking at. They can just see from the cover page, okay, this is the SWO. Okay, I see that. And for supply closet providers who have the SWO and the proof of delivery on one document, we put that on the cover sheet. So the auditors are not looking at it, think it's only an order or only a proof of delivery. You're kind of like feeding them because the goal is that you don't want to fail that audit. Certainly you can appeal it, but why would you want to appeal it? Because it takes resources for you to appeal. Plus the error is already there if the auditor missed it. So you want to definitely make sure that it is really easy for them to see. Always respond to the medical records.
I just want to let you know that we're at the top of the hour and we have another question. So I don't know if you want to pause after this slide and we can go to that question.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That time went by so fast.
Yes, it did. So the question is, our company failed a UPIC audit 6 months ago, and we failed almost every one because the referral didn't have chart notes that address the equipment being supplied. What will happen next, if anything?
That's a very good question. That sounds like you have a 100% error rate. The UPIC takes into consideration a lot of factors. And this is why, I guess probably this is a perfect question to underscore the first strategy that I had listed there. A good offense is the best defense. Intake. You should not be dispensing anything without getting the medical records. You cannot rely on the doctor that they're going to have that in their medical records because the reality is that they won't. Most times they write the prescription because they know the patient need it, but they're not always trained on to documenting the need for DME. So you get in that medical records, no matter how small the item is, get that medical records validated before it's dispensed. Specific to your question, it's likely that the UPIC will come and audit potentially more claims. And if they continue to see that as a trend or a pattern, they consider you a risk. And it's likely that they may move towards suspension. And in addition to suspension, it's a possibility that they may audit and extrapolate you. So that's definitely something that you need to take seriously, even if that prescribing doctor did not have medical records. If there are any other practitioners, maybe there's home health notes, nursing home notes, you definitely should get that records in order to respond to that. Well, at this point, you have an error rate. So what they're going to do is to refer those claims over to the MAC, and the MAC will send you an overpayment letter to which you can appeal. But
And
try
I
and get
don't
as
know
much
if you,
documentation as you
yeah.
possibly can.
And I don't know if you have representation, but because of the potential significant financial impact, if you haven't, it would be a good idea to do that to help you through any of the appeals.
Yeah, and I would add, depending on, I don't know how you obtained the prescription, if you were initiating that or getting kind of sending that information. It depends on how the intake was set up. That I would just make sure that we have all of the other things considered, just in case they look at this as potential fraud, to make sure that you are to have everything else with regards to things we talk about, the compliance program, all of the training, everything else in place as well, because 100% error rate is definitely going to draw some red flags.
I would like to just go to the next question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Where do you look to find out what audits your company has active? And Noel, I want to ask you to
Great question. Sure. Great question. So because there are various auditing contractors, you unfortunately will have to check with each of the auditing contractors. The RAC has a portal that you can actually look on. We actually have a system where we check the RAC portal for all of our clients every Monday. I have a team that checks that. The MACs, for those audits, the TPE, they have portals where you can look on the portals to see if there's any audits there as well. The CERT, you can always reach out to the CERT by phone. They have a phone number and you can ask them if there's any active audits for your particular provider. The UPIC, you will know if you have a UPIC audit. I wouldn't necessarily say call the UPIC and ask if there's an audit out there for you per se, but I think you would know if there's a UPIC audit out there. And the SMRC, you can give them a call. The UPIC is really not one that I would want to draw attention to myself. But the other contractors, you definitely can reach out to them and ask, provide them with your MPI P10 tax ID, and they certainly will be able to provide you with any audits that are out there outstanding.
So we are past our time and we have a few more slides. I'm happy to stay on and go through the end of them. We understand if people have to drop off. So I will just continue to go through. We'll try to get through the rest of the slides. And as Noel said, if you have
Perfect.
to drop off, if you're going to be at the MAMES conference, you're going to get follow-up on this topic there.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Anne. And the time just went by so fast. When we're talking about audit, we just get all excited. But again, I promise you, come out to the MAMES and we'll have a lot more time for dialogue and discussion on these and hear your unique scenarios and be able to answer and make practical recommendations. So audit strategies, again, monitor the review results letters, make sure that they're correct. I see a lot of errors that we get back from the RACs and the SMRCs that are incorrect because they misinterpret the policy. So utilize those discussion periods, send it back to them and said, hey, this was incorrect according to the published regs. I've had certs that denied claim erroneously, and I sent them an email and say, hey, this was denied in error. And they said, oh, yeah, you're right. We're going to remove this error without us having to even do an appeal. The same thing with TPE. So make sure that you're reviewing the results because they're human too. They make mistakes. But if you understand the documentation requirements, you should be able to push those back. And COVID-19 waivers. If you're going to utilize the COVID-19 waivers, just keep in mind that in order to be eligible with those COVID-19 waivers, the claims would have to have been built with the CR modifier and the COVID-19 narrative. So you couldn't have an intention of using one of those waivers, maybe the proof of delivery or the face-to-face requirement, but you didn't build the claim accordingly. In that case, that claim may not be subjected to those waivers and flexibilities. But if you're doing an appeal, you can definitely ask for those things to be added. I would definitely recommend that you print all the PHE guidance now and keep them in a folder and label it COVID-19 waivers, because who knows in a couple of years if those waivers will disappear from the website and all of a sudden COVID becomes a distant memory and you're then left with audits that would qualify based on the waivers. The other thing on the last item on this slide is the program integrity manual actually limits audit for DME providers to maintain records for 7 years. You can go to the next slide, and I have a draft letter. I use this letter with the appeals and with the RAC. They were auditing the catheters, and patients have been on there for 20 years, the closed catheter system, and they're coming and asking for documentation showing the patient qualify, which meant that they had to be on a closed system, a straight tip or coude, and that they would have had recurrent UTIs. And I pointed it out to the RAC. I said, well, Medicare only requires supplier to maintain records for 7 years. If this patient's utilization of this extends beyond that point, then by law, you can't ask the provider to provide initial need documentation. And with this letter, I've gotten all of those claims overturned. And actually, I've had a meeting with one of the auditing entities, and I started putting this letter in there proactively. And fortunately, these claims just don't even deny in the first place. You still have to provide proof that the patient has been on there beyond 7 years from the date of service that you're receiving the audit for. But once you prove that, you should not have an issue in having to justify initial need. Next slide, please.
I want to make a
So the
comment
appeals,
really quick.
real quick.
So I'm sorry, I just want to add one
Sure, go
thing.
ahead.
When it comes to the comment that you made about with the intention to bill using a waiver, but not using the appropriate coding and billing, it's important that if you are aware of this, that you do consider the Medicare overpayment rule and make sure that you're making those, overpayment, giving that money back to Medicare if you are aware that you have done this. Don't wait for the government to knock on your door and do an audit and find it. It's best to just go ahead and address that on the front end. So just figure, considering we're talking audits, the returning an overpayment is very important if it's identified.
That is, and we can actually do a whole new sessions on that, because there's some revision
Very
being
true.
proposed now that makes it very, very, very serious. The implications of not returning money to Medicare in a timely manner. It actually does violate the Filed Claims Act. Anyway, so the different levels of appeals: redetermination, reconsideration, ALJ, DAB board, federal district court. We've practically gone through all of these, most of these with our clients. All but one, the federal district court. We haven't had any DAB cases yet that have denied. Just be familiar with these. I want to jump through this real quick. I'm trying to be cognizant of your time and give you the information that you signed up for. So good audit, yes. Good audit strategies. Some of those strategies, some of the additional stuff that I wanted to share. Again, everything starts at yes.
Am I the only one hearing that?
No,
Okay.
the audible audio is.
Yeah, there's a lot of feedback coming from you right
Really?
now. Now it's clear.
Yes, better.
You're good now. Okay. Sorry.
All right. So the audit and appeal strategy starts at intake. Getting that documentation before you dispense the item is key. It might seem costly, but trust me, it's a worthwhile investment. It makes sense for you to have the documentation and know that you are protected in the event of an audit than guessing whether or not the doctor is going to have that documentation. So get that documentation up front. The separator sheet, utilizing that again. This one is important. That's not in the appeal, the audit, but in the appeal. It's a MLN article SC 1521. It's called limiting the scope. It's important for you to understand this, because what it does, it tells the MAC, the QUIC, that they have to limit the reason for their denial to the reason where the previous contractor denied. And this is why this is important. In the past, prior to this guidance, that you might have gotten an audit from the RAC, and the RAC denied because you're missing proof of delivery. So you submit that proof of delivery to the MAC in redetermination. The MAC says, oh, we now have the proof of delivery, but the medical records doesn't support that the item meets the Medicare criteria. Well, that's a problem because I wasn't responding to that. So what this does, it limits the review of the auditing entity, the Medicare administrative contractor or the qualified independent contractor to the reason why the previous entity denied it. So in my example, if the MAC denied for proof of delivery, then if the recovery audit contractor denied for proof of delivery, then the MAC cannot deny for medical necessity. You have to stick to that reason. Utilizing secure method for submission, ESMD, or the MACs and the QUIC have their own portal. Use the waivers timely filing waivers if you need those because of natural disasters or PHE, and also send the files and appeals through different methods that are more secure through the portal. You can move on. I think I'm almost done. Successful appeal strategy, be mindful of the time frame. You definitely want to appeal timely to make sure that you're not dealing with timely filing issues. The quick has a second review process. So if you get a quick decision that you don't agree with, let's just say that you feel like they made an egregious error, you can actually fax it back to their re-review department and they'll take a second look at it. And if they think that they did make an error, they'll reopen that claim and allow it in your favor. But if they feel like the decision is valid, then they're just going to tell you the original determination stand, and it doesn't extend your time frame to be able to go to the ALJ. Review your claims to determine if the PHE waiver applies. Ask for modifiers to be appended. So if your intention was to bill a particular claim with the waivers, let's say a CGM, the patient didn't qualify based on the LCD requirement, but you built it without the CR modifier and the COVID-19 narrative, that claim gets audited and they deny it based on the LCD requirement. What you should do, and it's very important that you do this at level 1, you can ask Medicare to add the CR modifier on that claim and add the COVID-19 narrative. Then you get the protection of the waivers of the PHE, even though you didn't have it before. So very important that you actually utilize those strategies. All right, and real quick, just some post-PHE guidance, and I think we're there. So CMS has given some indication about what will happen in the PHE, post-PHE realm in terms of audit. They have given their Medicare administrative contractors, the RACs and the SMRC, guidance that claims that were during the public health emergency that were billed according to the waivers and flexibilities ought not to be audited post-PHE. But what's important to note is that this guidance from CMS did not restrict the UPIC from auditing those claims, the CERT from auditing those claims, or the OIG. So don't just say, oh, yes, these claims are never going to be audited, so I have to not worry about anything. Keep in mind that if these other program integrity contractors identify any aberrancy in your billing pattern or any risk area, they do have the authority to audit. You just don't have to worry about the RACs and the MACs and the SMRC. But again, those claims needed to have been billed with the CR modifier and the COVID-19 narrative. That is how they will identify the claims that they would potentially not audit within this time frame. Next slide. All
Okay.
right, so one quick thing before I let you wrap up, Anne, on that. Some things CMS is going to be publishing, CMS will be publishing, I should say, some Q&As that helps providers navigate sort of this post-PHE realm, and it will address different issues. There's going to be 2 Q&As from my understanding. There's going to be one that addresses everything else, general DME, and there's going to be one that addresses CGM specifically. And they will talk about the patients that have qualified during the PHE and what will happen to those patients post-PHE. CMS did say that this guidance will come out in early April. So I am expecting to see this guidance published any day now, because as we know, they have to give us, well, they should give us enough time to prepare and plan for it. CMS did announce that the CR modifier is going to be removed following the post-PHE, but we're having dialogue with CMS behind the scenes through the AAOM Care RAD Council to see if we can get them to allow that to remain on grandfather patients following the post-PHE. Historically, when patients lose item due to natural disaster, we've never removed the CR modifier. We allow it to bill until the item is capped out. So just keep your eyes peeled to your inbox. CMS will be publishing that Q&A, and I believe that Q&A will answer majority of the questions that us as an industry will have. And if there are any other remaining questions that are not answered there, we'll be happy to tackle them at MAMES in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
Anna, I'll turn it back over to you.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you for staying on even past the hour. Hopefully you can make it to the MAMES Spring Conference. The presentation we've done today has been recorded and will be available on the MAMES website if you want to look at the slides and or listen to the presentation or have others listen to it. We would very much appreciate you giving us some feedback on the presentation today. So as soon as this is over, you will receive that survey. And again, just helps us to craft future topics and make this education really meaningful for you all as part of MAMES. So remember, good defense, the best offense is a good defense. Be prepared. The audits are likely to ramp up after the PHE, and more details on the specifics at the MAMES conference. Thank you very much, Rose. I don't know if there's anything else that you need me to cover, but we very much appreciate your attendance. Thank you.
I want to add one last thing there. We still have the free, the complimentary gap analysis for MAMES members. You can use this QR code to show your interest. There's also an opportunity to go to show your interest as well at the end of the survey that you'll receive at the end of the webinar. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good week.